I know, I'm in a completely different area of my home. It is the kitchen, somewhere I live at least 50% of the time in my life. And that's because I've got the amazing HelloFresh as a sponsor for this video. We all know who HelloFresh are. They're the people who deliver delicious recipe boxes to your door so you can get healthy, save time, and even be environmentally sound by not creating too much waste, which is something that I find unbelievably helpful because these days, I have very little imagination, and when I go on HelloFresh and I basically select the meals that are going to work for my family because they do lots of plant-based and vegetarian meals, it just means that firstly, I don't have to think too much outside of the box myself, and secondly, I learn how to cook incredible dishes that I wouldn't ordinarily even think about cooking, which is what I'm going to do today, because I'm going to take you through one of the amazing meals that HelloFresh recipe boxes offer. And there's also a discount code, so you guys, you want to get on here, get involved, get yourself some of these delicious meals, then just follow that code. And bear in mind, these are family boxes. You can literally feed the whole family a nutritious alternative to your humdrum menu. I'm not saying you've got a humdrum menu. Just saying I might. Just saying I might have a humdrum menu where we have pretty much the same food until, of course, I started using HelloFresh. It's kind of a bonus that they're my sponsor because I use them anyway. So it's really good because I can demonstrate how easy this is because this is how we mix it up in our family. And all of you know that we have kind of weird dietary requirements in my household. So honestly, if you've never tried it before, you may as well use the discount to actually try it because it's going to introduce you to a whole new world of cooking. But also, realistically, it's probably going to help you up the health aspect of the food that you eat. Because I think a lot of us, we just get into convenience and we forget to have that relationship with food. And HelloFresh allows you to connect again with that relationship. I'm going to make a curry today. It's actually one that I really love. And all you get in these boxes is everything that you need, along with the recipes themselves. Also, just to know that I've actually got a box of 3 meals for 4 people right now. This is why it's this big. Might not be as big if there's only you living at home, but that's the brilliant thing about HelloFresh. They literally cater for everyone. So there we have it, delicious, nutritious meal in like 20 minutes, just over 20 minutes it takes, and that's for 4 people. So if you are busy, time-starved, this is the solution. Honestly, HelloFresh is awesome, and the most important thing is, it tastes really good. Try it, just comment below. Get on it now. Hi and welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. It's always me, don't know why I keep saying that. Maybe it's the first time you've arrived here, so I'm just informing you that that's who I am. Hi, I'm Emma Kenny. I do release content very consistently though, so if you like crime, you like a bit of consistency and regularity in your life, this is definitely the channel for you. Wednesdays and Sundays, on the dot, always out there. Also, tend to be on for a premiere, so I can have a live chat with you and you can get in touch, tell me your thoughts, comment, like, subscribe. You know you want to. Well, even if you don't want to, that's fine. If you're here and you're watching, you're doing me an amazing favour, so thanks very much. Also, for those of you who've joined my membership, wow, I am loving all the suggestions. It's great because it means that you do some of the hard work for me. Thinking up some of the crimes that I want to cover is quite challenging, so when you tell me what you desire, it's very helpful. Thank you very much. It's been nice chatting with some of you on Discord. You can join there. Also, just to say, loads of new podcasts coming out on my Patreon channel. Can I just say thanks, guys, for all your support. It's flipping unbelievable. Really appreciate it. You are all adored individually and as a group. I am going to be covering a case today A few of you have asked for this one. It's one I've also wanted to cover, but there wasn't loads of material out there, so I've kind of waited to just gather bits and bobs together and then obviously get the court reports, which is what I find really helpful. A lot of you will know this case if you are in the UK. I'm sure that some of you who are in America, Australia, Brazil, all the other places that watch probably won't have heard this case. It was big in the headlines with a very specific type of headline that was pertaining to this individual choosing sex over her children. I'm going to hopefully inform you of how this crime actually played out and maybe take away from that bigger headline and kind of extract the information that I think is really important about this case to explain how this happened. Did anybody think it was going to happen? Were there any warning signs? What created this individual and how did it play out? So Louise Porton is who I'm going to cover. She was born in 1997, so she's a young person. She had 2 siblings, and to all intents and purposes, when you look at the family history, it was a close-knit family. But the reports from those who knew Louise was that when she was at family functions, when she was involved in kind of family experiences, she kind of acted like an outsider. That's specifically how she's described as an outsider. So according to her extended family, she also had a very violent streak as a child. She was somebody who people were wary of. They would all as a family visit their grandmothers every Sunday. I'm sure a lot of us have done that back in the day, probably do today even, but certainly it was the same for me. On a Sunday, it was your grandparents' day, whether they came to you or you went to them. And there is something about that kind of family connection that usually bodes really well, because when you have strong attachment and close bonds, psychologically you just tend to fare better. You know where you've come from, you feel supported within your world around you, and you have a place to go in the more challenging of times and crisis. So the fact that she has these close bonds and they also do things together as a family should be something that's really suggesting well-adjusted mindset. But that's not how it plays out, reported by her family at least. Her cousin, well, she described the fact that Louise would viciously attack family members. And what she would do was to basically try to hurt the children particularly, but without people noticing. So when you think about being a young person, pretty early on, you recognise what appropriate standards are for behaviour. You develop a conscience, and part of that conscience is that you articulate emotionally, and certainly societally, that there are consequences should you go out of your way to hurt somebody else, particularly if those people are younger kids, for example, and you're older. If you are actively doing that but trying to avoid being caught, well, that tells us a really interesting story, doesn't it, about your character, which is that you don't necessarily have the conscience. You're quite happy to harm the people that you're meant to love as long as you don't get caught. So you're not happy with the consequences, maybe that causes you to be disciplined or sanctioned. So the way that you deal with wanting to be violent to those individuals that are potentially weaker than you is to make sure it is done in a way where nobody notices. So as a child, it seems that Louise Porton has a degree of manipulation, and we could argue some rudimentary sophistication in her actions, i.e. noticing that if you act a certain way and it's not tolerated, there might be some negative consequences for you, and she's trying to avoid that. Also, she wasn't somebody who got involved with other family members. She obviously did things that were negative towards them, but she didn't do positive pro-social family interaction. She'd actually just sit and stare at family members and actually give them, quote, really horrible looks. And her cousin said, if anyone sat near her, she'd say, go away or I will smash your face in. So, I know, we've all been teenagers. Sometimes during those teenage years, we may be less than perfect in the way that we interact with people around us, particularly people that are younger than us, for example. But most of us won't have constantly threatened children in our family with violence, and particularly not when all they're doing is sitting near that person. that introduces us to some worrying behaviour, and it's definitely a red flag. From 11 years of age, there's another disturbing feature, and that's that she starts stealing from her grandmother. Again, stealing from family members is not completely atypical. Lots of children and young people will try to get away with taking money from family members because we like having money, we like being mischievous, most of us like being able to acquire things that we want, and even though we absolutely know that it's wrong, because they are a family member, we will often believe that it bridges a gap, i.e., okay, I'm stealing, but is it really stealing because it's from a family member? And a lot of people quantify that decision in that way. But when you actually draw down, it's really negative behaviour to take from somebody that you're actually meant to love and care for. And when there is a vulnerability of that individual as well, say they're older, and that money is really important, say it's a pension, then you're exploiting vulnerability. Another big red flag. Also, it was noted, in quotes by her family, she was quite an angry child, and it got worse when she was a teenager. She was always after money. Louise never apologised for anything. That's another red flag, isn't it? So if you are an individual who does something wrong and you can't apologise for it, be accountable, take responsibility, there are different layers to that potential, aren't there? So number one, it is that you absolutely know that you've done something wrong. You feel a level of shame. You want to run away from the situation, so you literally will not communicate about it. So an apology doesn't come, but not because you don't have a conscience, because you are full of shame and you are angry that you've been found out. And whilst you know it was wrong and you have a feedback that isn't comfortable, you just don't want to confront it. But on another level, if you can be really nasty or steal, and when you get caught, it not seemingly bother you and you're not apologising for it, well, again, we think about pathological liars. We think about individuals who can exploit others for whatever they need to achieve because they're not thinking about the other person's feelings. Then that does give us some ideas about, let's say, developing psychopathy. I'm not saying at this point that Louise is. I'm saying that we're certainly seeing red flags that are not typical and not expected for teenagers her age. And this idea of never apologising even when you are banged to rights and people have found out that you've done something wrong, even if you don't believe that you are sorry internally, you would usually say it because it will either get you off a hook, get you forgiven, or mean that people let things lie, right? So there is a motivation to say sorry sometimes, even if we don't feel it, because it changes the way that people operate around you. If you are not willing to do that, then one could say, well, you could be incredibly stubborn, but one could say that you just don't process the world how other people are processing it. It doesn't bother you. You don't care about the way people perceive you. It's not your concern. And that is deeply worrying, because when we see personality traits like that, that's very antisocial. Even though Louise Porton's family have said this, it's also worth noting that her mother, Sharon, she has a different story to tell. She says that she remembers Louise as a happy, loving girl. And I can imagine that most parents would want to remember children that way. I would say that it's a bias that a lot of us hold anyway. For the majority of mums and dads out there, you don't sit there on a daily basis wistfully remembering their paddies and when they threw food across the wall. You tend to remember the Christmas celebrations and the great parts because nostalgia tends to draw out more positive than negative memories. So her mum could be a little bit misguided with these memories, or her mum could be focusing on particular age frames, because it does turn out that Sharon did leave Louise when she was 11 years of age. She went off with another man, and that left Louise's father to raise her and the two siblings. That would be really traumatic for any child. Anybody who's ever had a parent abandon them, that's challenging. because the child will believe that the person that you have left them for is either more important, or they may process that potentially they've done something wrong and that's why you've left them. And there are so many unanswered questions. And 11 is a really difficult developmental age anyway. You're looking at transitions to high school, you're looking at changes puberty-wise, hormonally, and then on top of that, you're feeling that your family dynamic has shifted greatly. And this idea that potentially she felt that her mother chose another man, even if that wasn't the case, it's about interpretation, isn't it? Your perception is your reality. So for Louise Porton, it could be that she felt that her mother had disregarded her. Equally, it can also be why potentially her mother thinks that she was a happy kid, because she probably was at points in her early childhood. And I would also imagine that at 11, when her mum leaves, that's an instrumental trigger in the decline that we see in Louise Porton's behaviour, because she probably felt deeply resentful. And it does seem to have deeply affected her. She was actually estranged from her mother for years. When you see that kind of fracture and it carries on playing out, it's because there are unresolved issues. And if there are unresolved issues, it's because there is resentment, hostility, bitterness, sadness, a whole heap of very challenging feelings to process. And as a kid, when you're holding those and you can't necessarily manifest effective coping strategies, or you don't have help with somebody figuring it out so that you know how to deal with those challenging emotions, it can present in a whole host of negative ways, such as being violent, such as being disagreeable, such as being a not very nice person, because it can come from a place of pain. I'm not saying that's the case for this person. I'm just saying that we can see that parents leaving can impact children this way. Another thing that seems to change in Louise Porton's behaviour is the way that she starts to experience the opposite sex. So as she starts to get older, she becomes highly promiscuous, and it's noted that she would sleep with anyone who showed her attention. That's important, because if you feel a level of abandonment, then you'll seek validation. And if you can find people to validate you, then you can feel a level of worthiness. Now, the problem you've got is if you're seeking it in areas where you will only temporarily be gratified that way, it can actually exacerbate the negatives. Because all of a sudden, you're being thrown away again and again and again. It's a reinforcer constantly that you're not really worthwhile. And if you have incredibly low self-worth, sometimes it's even hard to value anything around you or within your world, because you don't really value anything you do. Also, it can be argued that certain people sleep with others constantly, changing partner or having one-night stands, because they enjoy it. There is no doubt there is a tiny percentage of people who are very liberal sexually and don't necessarily have any negative feedback from that experience. What we see with Louise Porton is that she realises there is an opportunity to use that type of behaviour to gain money. So she's very interested in sleeping with guys who can provide her with some financial assistance. She later will go on Facebook after she's had these sexual experiences and actually brag literally about how much money she could make from selling sex. There's a bit of me, when I think about that psychological position, that the aggression that she's showing there, the I can make this much money by selling my body, there is a level of her wanting to be in control and be powerful, isn't there? And also to let the world know that she can make cash this way. So she's somebody who could be used by guys and could just be thrown to the side, or she's somebody who could use them. I think we can probably all agree that her mindset is probably not the most well adjusted, because it seems potentially like the fact that she's using this as a stick to beat those who may want to judge her, because she feels that now they'll see that actually she's in control because she's making money, is actually counterproductive. It shows people actually that you probably have quite low self-esteem, low self-confidence, and you're desperate to look like you are powerful, and you're desperate to make it seem that you're happy doing what you're doing. Again, this is just me assuming things. She could well be really, really happy doing what she's doing. But sometimes it's important to kind of look at the formation, isn't it, of a human being? And I think with Louise Porton, we have some really problematic red flags early on. Trauma, which again, massive exacerbator of problems if you have a particular antisocial profile. And then on top of that, this behavior that probably isn't psychologically, physically, or emotionally healthy that she's getting involved in. She gets estranged pretty much from her entire family for a period of time. This is following the death of her grandmother. And the reason that they get really upset with her is because Louise Porton just refuses to go and visit her grandma when she's ill. This is a grandma who'd been really good to her. To add insult to injury, she didn't even go to the funeral. That is a big statement, isn't it? Now, we could say, well, it's a statement of somebody who feels let down and hurt by their family and doesn't want to play the game and is unwilling to turn up because actually their feelings and sentiments aren't powerfully emotional in a positive way. They could be really angry. But I think what the family interpret this as, and I would err on the side of what the family is saying, is that they feel that the grandmother was a really important, significant figure for Louise and that she's just throwaway. That essentially she's died, she's been ill, she's been there for Louise before, and yet in her moment of crisis, Louise hasn't come to the house to visit her, and then when she's died, she's not even given them the respect as a family, and certainly for the individual, her grandmother, by turning up and being sad. But if you don't have a lot of empathy, if you don't feel how you or I feel, then the consequences can be that it's really no big deal for you. Again, when we're looking at potential red flags, low empathy, callous behaviour, we're seeing it, aren't we, with this individual? Yeah, we can recognise and acknowledge that her life hasn't been perfect. We can see some behaviours that aren't ideal, and we can also recognise some criminal behaviours such as stealing that she's engaged in. But now we're being introduced to this real low empathy and callous behaviour, and her family are just not having it, and they reject her because of that. At least a lot of the family do. Porton becomes a young mum. So she has a child at a relatively young age. She gives birth to her first child, Lexi Draper, when she's 18, which is going to be challenging. Having children at any age is difficult to some degree. Wonderful, amazing, incredible, best thing you'll ever do. I'm totally biased, but it is the best thing you'll ever do. But obviously, if you don't have the most supportive environment or the most financially supportive environment, it can be more challenging than ideally it should be because you're facing more hardships because of that. So by August 2016, she's living in Skiddaw in Rugby. She's in council housing and she's a single parent and mother of two, in fact, by that point. So she has 3-year-old Lexi and she also has 16-month-old Scarlett Vaughan. Absolutely gorgeous little girls. I'm sure a lot of you watching right now are obsessed with children as I am, and I would literally have people turn up at my door and leave kids and I would just take them in. Like, I absolutely adore children. I have a real primal connection with protecting them. I think most well-adjusted humans do. And when you look at Lexi and Scarlett, your heart is just like, wow, what gorgeous little girls. What we see in this relationship is that in spite of the fact that Louise Porton does have a man who's obviously got involved to some degree, he's called Chris Draper, he's not allowed to see his kids. So the contact has basically been controlled by Louise. He'd never even met Scarlett. I know, never even met. So he's father to 2 children and he doesn't even get to meet the second one. Now, this is apparently because Louise Porton moved from Walsall to Rugby, and it was specifically because she wants to deny him contact. Again, that's callous, isn't it? That's a callous behaviour. It doesn't matter what your relationship is like with your ex, as long as it's not highly abusive and dangerous. Clearly, children need to be protected from those things. But there's no reason why this man can't be a part of his daughter's lives. But she's actively preventing him from doing that. And she has a clear egocentricity there and a selfishness, because her children want a dad. Every child who can have two parents, whatever genders they come in, would choose that, because you want to feel like you were deeply wanted. And it prevents some of those issues that we see playing out when people don't feel that they've been wanted as kids. But she doesn't want him to have any of that. So again, another controlling tick we've got here. So there's a lot of behaviours that are very selfish, very self-orientated. They're not concerned about his feelings, her children's feelings. It's about her and what she wants to control. So we've got a lot of red flags at this point, haven't we? To add to the fact that she doesn't want this father of the kids to have any contact, she actually gives Scarlett, her second daughter, the surname of another boyfriend. This is despite the fact that the girls are full sisters. So not just preventing him from having access, trying to prevent him from even having a lineage, a connection by name, which is very odd behaviour. So now Louise Porton is living with her two children. As I said, she's alienated from her ex, who she's had children to, and she's basically describing herself at this point as a part-time model, which is a fancy word in her world for being a sex worker. No judgments here. People make the money. Whatever makes you happy, that's fine. But disguising the reality of what she's doing by a more presentable word to society as part-time model is duplicitous. It's not real. She is prostituting herself. So she would offer men that she met online nude photographs for cash. She'd offer them sex for cash. And in one message to one potential customer, she actually said that she was quite happy to have sex with him in her bedsit that she shared with her children. Bedsits, to those of you who might not be in the UK, are really small. Sometimes they don't even have a bathroom. You might share a bathroom with somebody else, but it's like a bedroom, and it's kind of got a chair bed, a little area where you might be able to cook, but it's really tiny. So the fact that there was a bedsit would mean that there were not other bedrooms for the children. And she's saying that she'll have sex with him in the room where her kids are, but they'd have to be quiet. Really poor boundaries. Really poor boundaries. You know, the fact that you would even consider bringing a man into your home and to have sex with them in front of your kids, albeit quietly, it introduces a danger to your kids. You don't know who's coming home. Men are stronger than women. It doesn't matter how tough you think you are. A guy, even if he's smaller than you, is likely to have more strength. So if you're bringing somebody through that front door, you are putting your children at risk, and she's willing to do that. So again, this selfishness, this lack of empathy, this poor understanding of boundaries, this poor impulse control, we're seeing all of that with Louise Porton, aren't we? It's as simple as that. Now, aside from working under her own name, she also worked under the name Lollipop. That was on the website Purple Paw, which is a website that specialised in erotic cosplay and glamour work. So obviously she's putting herself out there in various outfits so that people are aware of her services, shall we say. From August 2016, this is until November 2017, early November, Porton lives at an address in Willenhall, which is near Walsall. And it's here that a landlady who she's living under basically spends miles more time caring for her kids. So Lexi and Scarlett ultimately start spending loads of time with this landlady because Louise Porton just is not available, because she's out doing social things, she's not attending to them, she's not looking after them. And the landlady actually said that she would do whatever she could not to have her daughters around, which to any decent parent just feels really off. I'm not going to deny that every parent at times wants to just sleep You know, you're like, I don't necessarily want to play the Lego game again. We've been doing it for 19 hours now, and I can't see straight. That happens to the best of us, but you don't want to abandon your kids. You don't want to go out and party. You don't want to do things that could put them at risk if you haven't got the correct support around you. And again, nothing wrong with us having a social life as parents. I encourage parents to have a social life. But again, the majority of parents that have a social life either feel a little bit of guilt when they do it because they care so deeply for their children, or enjoy it to a point and then get home because they want to protect them. So there are these whole primordial senses that so many of us have when it comes down to looking after our kids. Louise Porton doesn't have this. She's quite happy to go out and socialise and do whatever without her kids being around. And this landlady said on the rare occasions that she did look after them, what she noticed was that she would become very frustrated with them. She would swear at them, which drives me bonkers. Highly abusive. Don't swear at your kids. Swearing is an aggressive thing to do. I know, as we get older, they do occasionally slip out. When the kids are like teenagers, I appreciate that. But we keep a lid on it most of the time for the infancy, don't we? We just do that. Simple as. But the fact that she is aggressive and she's hostile and she gets really worked up quickly, another red flag, isn't it? I've got a lot of red flags today. Now, according to people who knew her, they said that she was literally out clubbing the moment she got an opportunity. That any chance to get out, that was what she would choose. And I can't judge her as being somebody who would be under the influence, but I would imagine it's not too big a stretch to think that she was probably drinking. So when you're under the influence, are you going to be accessible to your children? Are you going to be doing the job that your children need you to do? And unfortunately, statistically, you're less likely to be. So this is concerning. I'm not going to deny that as a single mum, which I was for a long time, you don't really have a lot of opportunities to de-stress. And it can be really tough at times to be a single mum. But Louise Porton wasn't somebody who didn't have people she could rely on in her life. I mean, apart from the landlady, who you're like, I'm your landlady. I think the way it's meant to work, Louise, is you're meant to pay me. You pay me your rent, and then I take the money, and then I go and do something with that money. I'm not sure that I'm meant to get paid for your rent and then basically give it all back in babysitting fees. I'm just throwing it out there. But you see, even the landlady who isn't blood related to this person feels that she wants to be present for the children. That's how decent human beings are. We have this natural inclination and instinct to protect children. And this landlady, albeit completely unrelated, is doing that. Louise also had family members who were willing to support her. So I'll bring in a sister. She did a lot. Even though Louise had had issues with the wider family because of her behaviour, Louise Porton's sister was pretty incredible. She did loads for her sister and loads for the children. And she was quite challenging towards Porton as well. It seems like, in spite of the fact that she has this supportive framework that's willing to step in and help her, that Louise Porton still resented the impact that motherhood had had on her social life and also on her sex life, because she's getting involved in making money through sex. So anything that interferes with that is going to be a problem financially. Now, on the 2nd of January 2018, Porton calls the emergency services, and what she says is that Lexi was experiencing breathing problems, which is obviously scary for any of us parents who've been through that. And Porton said that what she actually thought was that she suffered a fit. The ambulance obviously gets arranged, but then she calls back and she actually cancels the ambulance. She says she's got transport. Now, at this point, that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? I mean, to any of you who've ever had to call emergency services, if you've got somebody who can drive you there quickly, then you're avoiding having to wait. So as a worried parent, you're probably going to take advantage of that. She then takes Lexi to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, just think where you'd be. Your kid's got breathing difficulties, you're that concerned, you're taking them to A&E. Yeah? What are you going to be doing? Well, if it was me, I'd be meditating and going to my safe space whilst telling my child it was all going to be okay, desperately praying that somehow we could time travel before me running in and screaming, help my baby breathe. Something like that would play out in my head. That's the kind of place and space most of us parents are, because all we can think about is how do we protect this gorgeous bundle that inextricably is connected to our happiness and well-being, and they must survive and be well because it impacts on us so dreadfully if that isn't the case. Porton is actually messaging someone about photos of a sexual nature and also how much money was going to be involved. Red flags. Red flags. Certainly low empathy here, haven't we? Low compassion, low concern. Child's meant to be having breathing difficulties, and you're talking about what kind of pics you're going to send later on. This is really seriously unusual behaviour when a child is unwell. And even if we just throw in the vague, tiny possibility that this is somebody desperately trying to distract themselves because they can't bear the fact that their child is so unwell, why would you be doing something involving sexually motivated conversations? You know, albeit that you might want to play something online to just take your mind off it, but even that to me seems so far away from reality. But to get involved in some kind of sexual messaging seems very, very dubious. When they get to the hospital, the doctors obviously examine Lexi and they're really perplexed. Ultimately, they can't figure out what has happened, so they diagnose a chest infection and they prescribe her antibiotics. There's nothing that's really standing out to them that makes them think that there's anything potentially sinister going on. The child's had some breathing issues, there's potentially some congestion, so antibiotics obviously seem like something that a parent would happily accept and you go off on your way. However, 2 days later, so just 2 days later, this is the 4th of January 2018, she calls emergency services. Again, now at this point, she says that Lexi's had a fit. Paramedics then arrive at Porton's bedsit. At this point, Lexi's actually in a really critical condition. She's lay on her back, she's flat, she's in a deep state of unconsciousness. And if it had not been for the resuscitation skills of the paramedics who were there, there is no way that she would have survived. She would definitely have died. The paramedic who later testified in court, well, they said that he had absolutely no idea why the child was as ill as she was. And all he could conclude at the time was that maybe she could have been suffering from some severe respiratory illness. But again, we're getting introduced to this sudden onset of something without anything that's really significant for them to note. Louise Porton is noted by the paramedics at this point that she's apparently upset, but she's not screaming and she's not crying. And that interests me because can you imagine your child being resuscitated? I mean, most of us would probably lay prostrate on the floor also being resuscitated because our heart had stopped during the fear and panic. Is it just me? That's how I imagine it is going to be if that ever happens to one of my kids. And I'm sure that some of you have been through that. They would probably have to give me as much medical attention as my child. And if I wasn't lay on the floor, unconscious, because I've completely lost it, I'd probably be running up and down the street, screaming hysterically. It does not do any good. I appreciate that. But in those moments, you are not processing the world as you would ordinarily. And she isn't. She's upset. But they're not noting that she's being hysterical or panicky or desperate. And when she gets in the ambulance, when they're taking her daughter to hospital, they noted that she wasn't distressed at all. The doctors again examine the child and they are again very perplexed. Lexi is in a critical condition, but they can't figure out what's provoked it. They are not at all suspicious, by the way, at this point. The doctors then prescribe her some more antibiotics because clearly they think that she might be needing to fight something, an infection. Now, whilst Lexi is actually getting treated in the hospital, Porton goes to the toilet, and I know what you're thinking, breaks down, sobs, has to be escorted out on a trolley given oxygen and told it's all going to be fine, before selflessly promising that she will never leave her child again. Yes, that's what you'd expect. But no, Louise Porton goes to the toilets and just takes topless photos of herself. She's like, my kid's nearly died. How shall I handle this? I'll just get my boobs out and send some topless photos to some random guy. Yeah, that literally happened. She also messages this photographer, and I know what you're thinking, well, she's the model. And ideally, when you have your pictures taken by a photographer, they don't want to get sexually involved with you, because that kind of seems a little bit creepy and inappropriate for a photographer, but not for Louise's photographer, no. In fact, they have a conversation on Messenger when they are actually in a scenario where she is dealing with a child who's been seriously unwell, and she's just texting him about participating in sex acts during a photo shoot as long as he pays cash into her bank account. I mean, is that just me? It's just me that is like the most offensive thing to even be considering when your child has been so desperately unwell. She even, on that occasion, manages to pass a number to a hospital security guard. So if nothing else, she works fast. I think we can agree with that. She actually went on to exchange 87 messages with that security guard. So she's just wandering around and picking people up as she can. And yet she's doing this whilst her child has been mortally unwell. This is beyond strange behaviour for somebody whose child has been admitted to hospital in a critical condition. And if anybody was looking at this behaviour, alarm bells would be ringing. They wouldn't be ringing, they would be screaming, wouldn't they? Because it says there is something really wrong going on right now. The 14th of January 2018, and bear in mind we've had this little girl now twice very unwell in a short amount of time. So earlier in the day, on that day, CCTV at Porton's block of flats shows her entering with her kids. Now Lexi and Scarlett appear fit and well. Simple as that. They look absolutely fine. There is nothing that introduces you to either of those children being in pain or unhappy or restless. They're not crying. They're certainly not walking around like they're struggling. So we are not introduced to any concerning behaviour at this point. The kids look well. However, in spite of that CCTV showing them that they're well, Porton contacts the emergency services about Lexi shortly before 1 a.m. on the 15th of January. So again, she's in contact with the hospital. The call handler inquires about the condition that her daughter's in. She asks her if she's still breathing, and Louise Porton implies no.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No.
They're not breathing?
No.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3. Bear with me. Okay. So she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged, okay?
And she says that she's found Lexi dead in her bed, basically, which would be absolutely traumatising, and for anybody who's ever had to deal with the loss of a child, it's unimaginable for people who haven't been through that. But to find a child in bed dead, you are going to be out of your mind, literally out of your mind. This is your worst nightmare playing out in front of you. So when the paramedics reach Lexi, they examine her and there's literally nothing they can do at all. She's totally beyond saving, and she'd been dead for quite a long time. So her skin was pale, it was mottled, her lips were blue, and rigor mortis had actually already started to set in. So this is worrying, because you'd imagine that a mother might have noticed if a child had died, even though it's 1 a.m, what time would she have had to go to bed for this period of time to have passed where a child's got rigor mortis? When they do the initial post-mortem, they actually can't find any obvious cause of death. So, understandably, suspicion isn't on Louise Porton at this point because they're not finding anything that's unbelievably untoward. It's very unusual for a child to die like this, but it's not outside the realms of possibility for it to happen. So Louise acts upset initially. She looks like she's struggling in those initial moments. And even though there is this momentary upset, she suddenly seems to get back on with herself. So this initial momentary sadness, and then she just carries on with her life as normal. She didn't seem distressed. And in fact, if you want evidence of the fact that she didn't seem distressed, we have to look at her behaviour. So the day after Lexi's died, she accepts 41 friend requests on the dating app Meet Me. 41. A busy little bee, isn't she? For somebody who's meant to be in the throes of grieving for the loss of her gorgeous little girl. Also, aside from just busily accepting Meet Me requests, she's also just messaging men on the dating social network Badoo. Yeah, just having a chat, as you would, with some random guy, whilst literally not being 24 hours since you've lost your child. And during one of the conversations, she's chatting to a man called Dave. Good solid name there, Dave. And at this point, she's chatting about a leg tattoo. Yeah, she's chatting about a leg tattoo with Dave, less than 24 hours after her gorgeous child has died. And at this point, she just throws into the conversation, my little girl passed away yesterday. He then says, I'm really sorry. And she replied, it's all right. It's all right. It's all right. It's fine. It's all right. No worries. Don't worry about it. Don't let it bother you. Said no distressed, grief-stricken mother ever. If that wasn't bad enough, she even arranges to go on a date with a man called Leon that night. That night. When I learn about cases like this, and I think about the amount of people out there who just never get to be parents, and I get examples like this woman who, within hours of her child being found dead, hasn't even got the good grace to stay away from this kind of loose behaviour because it would make her look bad. She hasn't even got the wherewithal to just think about that. All that matters is her impulses, her money. All that she's concerned about is herself. And bear in mind, she has a child who's just lost a sibling. Wouldn't you just want to be spending loads of time with that child and just making sure that they were at least okay, safe? You know, the worst thing you would imagine is that something terrible could happen to your other child. Is that just me that feels that that would be the natural inclination? But no, Louise Porton is just into going out, earning some money, having sex, and so on and so forth. That's within 24 hours. And then around 2 weeks later, she's actually heard laughing at the funeral parlour. At this point, I'm not sure if I had been the funeral parlour person, if Louise Porton may have found herself in a coffin nailed down. It's in my head, that image. I'm sure a lot of you will also connect with that feeling. It just is something innate with me. It's like you're laughing, your child is dead, you're in a funeral parlour. It's disrespectful and completely inappropriate. She's even seen making a video call with a client whilst arranging Lexi's burial at a funeral home. I don't know where to begin with this woman. Everything nurturing, it's just not available to us here, is it? It's like any of the natural nurture has been lost somewhere or never developed, because this is not how any parent who loves a child acts in any way when they're dealing with their funeral. It just goes against the grain per se. And when a friend actually asks about Lexi's death, Louise Porton, who you would imagine would just be writhing in agony dealing with the grief, she says in a jokey voice, I had 2, now down to 1. I mean, you might say that about a chocolate bar, a bottle of wine or 2, but the fact that she's talking about her little girl who's just died It's reprehensible, it's such bad taste, and it also shows a clear mismatch of what expectations others would have about the way you're meant to act and her feeling about it. We're just seeing a complete lack of empathy per se. It's as simple as that. Now, at the end of January 2018, Porton goes to stay in a hotel and she takes Scarlett with her. On the 1st of February 2018, bear in mind this is just 17 days after Lexi's death, CCTV shows Porton leaving the hotel and she's carrying Scarlett to her car. She later, by the way, claims that she did this because her daughter had become unwell. She wanted to get her checked over. And while she's going to the hospital to apparently get her checked over, Porton pulls over into a car park at Elliott's Retail Park in Rugby. And at this point, she calls an ambulance. She dials 111. And at this point, she claims that her daughter's condition basically doesn't seem too serious, which again is strange because if you're dialing 111, yes, ultimately you wouldn't necessarily think there was something terrible about to happen. But if you're in the car driving to the hospital, why wouldn't you just carry on going? I mean, it seems like you're on the way there. Why would you add minutes to the journey? She tells the operator that her daughter's asleep in the child seat. The operator then says, well, try and wake her. She tries to wake her and then she says she couldn't. She then tells the operator that Scarlett has stopped breathing and paramedics are sent out. They get to Scarlett 9 minutes later and basically, much like with her sister, there is nothing that they can do to save this gorgeous little girl. She's completely lifeless. There's evidence that she'd been dead for some time. She's officially pronounced dead 35 minutes later at University Hospital in Coventry. Bear in mind, Louise Porton has now lost 2 children in a very short space of time. How would you be? I mean, I think a lot of us would be trying to run in front of traffic to end our pain, wouldn't we? And I mean that genuinely. The agony of losing 2 children in such a short amount of time, you would be absolutely inconsolable. But apparently she's just cold, calm and emotionless following Scarlett's death. And what she tells the staff at the hospital is that Scarlett had recently been diagnosed with flu, which again, I suppose she's talked about the other one dying and has kind of got her head around the fact that the doctors had believed that there was some potential infection and maybe she's trying to create that ruse. But Warwickshire police are immediately suspicious. You've got 2 seemingly fit, healthy siblings. They've died less than 3 weeks apart. Neither of them have got any pre-existing medical issues. And when they've found these kids, both of them seem to have been dead for some time. That's before the paramedics had been called. So this is a really strange situation. Now, contrary to what Porton's telling them, the police start thinking there is something very suspicious here and they launch an investigation. And they do that for a very simple reason. They absolutely think that there is foul play involved. And instantly, they have one suspect. They're not looking anywhere else. They believe that Louise Porton is guilty of being involved in her children's deaths. So the investigators suspect that Scarlett was actually dead way before paramedics reached her. They think that Porton had actually killed her already. This is in the room at the hotel where they've been staying. And then she pretended that she was asleep, put her in the car, starts driving to the hospital. And the police believe that Scarlett had actually died because Louise Porton had deliberately obstructed the airway in her neck. So the reason for that is that Scarlett's neck showed some clear signs of compression and also was recent bleeding in her neck tissue. Also, there were traces of blood that were found on her pillow. So this indicates that Scarlett could also potentially have been smothered. When they did the post-mortem, they also were able to uncover signs of previous attempts to obstruct Scarlett's airways. So this wasn't the first time. On reflection now, the police are like, well, hang on a minute here. This is really scary because she's lost another child. So Lexi had died earlier, and that means now they're thinking, well, this woman could be responsible for both of their deaths. When they looked at the injuries on Lexi, The problem was initially, remember, that they didn't have very obvious signs. But even though there weren't as obvious signs, they do realise that it seems that both girls have suffered a similar fate. It's highly unlikely, incredulous even, to believe that two very healthy siblings have suddenly died of natural causes within 3 weeks of each other. And so the alarm bells are absolutely howling now, and they believe that they've got the person who is banged to rights for this crime. Now, Porton's mother, Sharon Porton, she later claimed, this is after Lexi's death, that Porton had told her Scarlett would be next. And she actually said that she sounded threatening. Now, I'm sure for Porton's mother, that's a reflective experience. So hindsight is 20/20, isn't it? Simple as that. You hear something in the moment, you think threatening, but actually it's in the context of somebody's just lost a child. Maybe she's saying that she's worried about losing another child, and that would be a normal fear. She's probably just put it down to that. But on reflection, she's thinking, well, actually, was it said with malice? So I think for Sharon Porton, she probably would be very upset with herself for not acting on that feeling that there was something sinister about the way that Louise Porton was speaking. But it's not how our brain works. You don't sit there thinking, yeah, my daughter's probably going to kill her kids. And without a shadow of a doubt, if Sharon Porton had realised that those children were in danger, she would have done something about it. When the police start analysing Louise Porton's computers as well, it's red flags everywhere, because the searches corroborate exactly what the police are suspecting. They find that the kids' deaths have been planned. In both of the occasions that she'd actually taken Lexi to the hospital, this is in early January 2018, when she's claiming that she's had a fit, she'd literally made internet searches beforehand about why a young child might stop breathing. I mean, why would you search that? Police also found loads of other concerning internet searches. These would all be used as evidence at the trial. So she hasn't been sophisticated as far as forensic goes, but bear in mind, this is a woman with no empathy and no compassion. She's quite arrogant. She's got away with stealing before. She probably thinks that she just needs to be able to look the part and she'll get away with this. Now, investigators, well, they're very confident that Porton had inflicted the injury on Lexi, that had initially required her to go to hospital on the 2nd of January 2018. And they also believed that it was the same on the 4th of January 2018. They felt that Louise Porton had done something that had caused critical impact on Lexi and put her in a critical condition. They felt that Lexi had had her airway obstructed in some way. They then believed that she'd just left her daughter to deteriorate until a point where she was looking at her and thinking there's no way they're going to be able to save her. At that point, the paramedics come, and it seems like it's probable that she had intended that Lexi would die, but they managed to do an amazing job and brought her back. They saved her life on that occasion. But it seems like that wasn't the plan. Louise Porton wanted her dead at that point, which is just harrowing. So on the day of Lexi's actual death, the police believed that she wanted to make no room for error. She didn't want to make the same mistakes again. She was searching on the internet for websites that had information about how long you could leave somebody to a point where resuscitation wouldn't be effective, and also how long does it take for a body to go cold. Her mobile phone records, though, think about the fact that we're talking about her planning and executing the death of her child. Her mobile phones actually show that she's sending a text to a man in which she claims that she's been told by doctors Lexi's gonna die. So she's even setting up some kind of weird emotional response from some random man, even though the only reason that Lexi is gonna die is because she's gonna kill her. The amount of manipulation and callousness in this is just stunning. She actually wrote, "I'm just really having a tough time with my 3-year-old being ill from that dreadful flu. Doctors telling me she's gonna die." Said no doctor ever, unless your child is in a hospital, hooked up, dying. But like I said, this child is now just a tool in her toolkit of procuring sexual relationships, money. That is just so cold. It's also completely untrue. Of course, we know that. She's not been told that by any doctor. So the police actually believe that Porton had murdered Lexi in the early hours of the 15th of January 2018. But then, as her searches on the internet seem to indicate, she'd purposely waited until Lexi was basically just beyond saving and then calls the emergency services, because the whole premise of this is she does not want the paramedics to resuscitate her child again. This is why, when they arrive, Lexi's been dead for some time, because she's orchestrated that. Then she has to obviously try to make it seem like Lexi's death has been completely natural. It's an unexpected one, but there's been no harm on her part. So at this point, clearly, she's in a scenario where she feels that she's got away with it. But when Scarlett dies, clearly all eyes are on what's happened, because they see that there's been a very similar pattern when it's around Scarlett's death. She's returned to the hotel room. She's been sending texts claiming that she's been told that Scarlett may die as well. Yet CCTV have captured her and her daughter shortly before, and Scarlett looks perfectly fit, perfectly well. Nothing whatsoever to suggest that Scarlett's even sick, let alone mortally unwell to the point where she's going to die. In fact, the only thing we can say is that Porton is planning what is going to happen to her daughter at this point. So she's letting this guy know that her daughter may die, but certainly not from natural causes, and absolutely because it's what she's planning. And that in itself, to imagine her own mother is texting some random stranger about sex while she is calculating how she is going to kill her child. It's mind-boggling, mind-bending, and deeply disturbing. As with Lexi, Porton this time has made sure that Scarlett doesn't get any help, because she doesn't let emergency services know until Scarlett is well and truly beyond saving. When the paramedics arrive, she's already dead. She's been dead for some time. She's freezing and lifeless, they describe her as. Sadly, this doesn't actually fit with what Porton's version of events are, because she said that Scarlett hasn't stopped breathing until she's got into her mum's car on the way to the hospital. So that now doesn't fit. Of course it doesn't. She shouldn't be freezing cold. She shouldn't be lifeless at that point in the way that she is. They also get CCTV footage from a petrol station because Louise Porton stopped to get fuel. I mean, why would you do that if you were in some kind of panic about your daughter who might die? You would not do that. And if you were stopping to get fuel because you were going to run out, you'd be hysterical, wouldn't you? And screaming for help. But that's not the case. And they're able to establish, to be fair, that at the point where they've got her on CCTV at the petrol station, Scarlett would already have been dead in that child seat. In fact, the truth is that the police said that they fully expected that Scarlett was dead when Porton carried her from her hotel to the car. So she absolutely knew there was no hope for that little girl at all. She fully wanted her dead. So this is tragic. There's two little girls who are now dead. Two babies, essentially, toddlers. They've had no life whatsoever. And the very person who is meant to have protected them against all the odds, against the slings and arrows of life, the person who's meant to be willing to lay down her life for them is the individual who is in the frame right now. It's the only person the police are looking at. How unlucky are those children? Of all the people that they could have been born to, it sounds like they're being born to a sadistic killer. Somebody who's manipulated, calculated, and carried out their murders. A few days after Scarlett's death, this is on the 5th of February 2018, a housing officer who's with Rugby Borough Council actually meets Porton because they want to discuss with her her accommodation arrangements. Now, at the point that the worker meets her, she's stunned. She cannot believe how unemotional Louise Porton appears. She's asking her questions that need to be asked about what she wants to happen to her children's belongings following the fact that they both died. Porton at this point apparently yawns and says, "I don't mind." Now, I don't know about you guys, but I can imagine that the majority of us would be vacuum packing all of the items so that we could smell them for the rest of our lives from time to time, because that's what you do when you're grieving. You don't want to let go of anything. Everything has meaning. That's why parents who lose children leave their bedrooms exactly the same 20 years down the line, because they want to hold that moment in time. They don't want to get rid of anything. But she's really not bothered at all. She's quite happy for things to just go, essentially. This is a massively unusual reaction from any mum who's just lost both her children. I suppose we could again throw in the potential that she's numb and completely unable to process what's happened and is just acting out in a way where she's just going through the motions, but secretly she's devastated. But obviously that's not true, is it? But we could throw it in that some people do act very numb when grief is consuming them. That isn't the case. And it really stands out to this worker. She feels that there's literally no emotion there. In fact, and I think this is a brilliant, brilliant quote, she said she was acting like someone who had just lost a goldfish. I think we can all agree. A lot of us have lost goldfish and felt devastated. We had one that lasted about 7 years. We were all gutted when that goldfish died, gutted. So we can agree that most people would probably react more upset when a goldfish died than Louise Porton did when her children have died. Awful. But it really stands out. Now, in the months following her daughter's deaths, another thing that Louise Porton does is she starts trying to sell their clothing, and again, that in itself, you know, for some compassionate humans who lose children, they have an internal strength that maybe I don't have, and they do things like give away their children's clothes, you know, they send them places where other kids can benefit. They have that ability to care deeply about others. For others, like me, they'd all be in the drawers, stored away forever. But selling them, no. When you sell something, it's transactional. And I don't think the psychology of transaction is where most of our brains go when we're dealing with the emotional grief. I think for anybody out there who's lost somebody that we love, we tend to just give the clothes away when we're ready. And that's if we can. A lot of people, like I said, keep hold of them. But no, she's just posting pictures of them in bin bags on the swap, sell, buy things in Rugby on the Facebook page there. And she just states on that, you know, there are clothes for girls aged 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, 9 to 12 months, and she was selling them for 20 quid. Also said that she could deliver. Oh God, it's so cold, isn't it? Even could deliver. Doesn't really care whether they're around. Just wants them out of the way. Wants some quick cash. Some quick cash, even though that comes from letting go of her apparently beloved daughters, you would imagine, but not Louise Porton. No, she's just quite happy to let it all go. It's hard to express how out of context it feels describing the reactions of this woman about the deaths of her kids. It just is wholly inadequate, isn't it? And if that doesn't get worse, the faux grief gets me even more, because on the 24th of November 2018, she actually posted tribute to her daughters on, you know, the classic, the place that's really intimate, you know, the place where you're most supported and most cared. Social media, still social media. It read, "Mommy's angels, taken from me so soon, you will never be forgotten. R.I.P. Mate, never be forgotten. You sold all the clothes for 20 quid on Facebook. The housing worker said you were less emotional than someone who lost a goldfish. This does not compute." But you know, she's putting it out there, isn't she? Oh, best act a bit sad. Best act a bit sad. Just pop a little status on Facebook or Twitter. That'll do the job. that's where most of us lend into our grieving immediately, isn't it? It's the one place where the police will be like, oh, guys, we've had all this suspicion about Louise Porton. All of us thinking that she's done something heinous to those children. Well, shame on us. Shame on, particularly you, John. Particularly you were very aggressive about Louise Porton. Deeply aggressive. You called her some serious names. Serious. And I'm telling you now, you need to take some time out to think about your actions, because it turns out Louise Porton is grieving desperately. She has posted a Facebook on Twitter. I know, guys. We all need to take a break. We're getting very aggressive in our prosecuting at the moment because this is definitely an innocent woman. Apologies for my sarcasm. But anyway, the police didn't do that. Investigation was still strongly continuing, and in January 2019, the police charged Louise Porton with Lexi and Scarlett's murders. Of course they do. I hope you're all cheering at home right now. Now, immediately she denies any ill treatment even. Forget murder. She's like, me? Why would you think that of me? You bought some of the clothes on Facebook for a bargain. Okay, that was probably not my best moment, but what other things have I done? Yeah, I was arranging sex with random guys in toilets when she was in hospital, but okay. What else makes you think of that? The searches about how long to leave the child. But aside from that, I've never ill-treated my child. Okay, I did leave them home alone occasionally and with the landlady, but apart from those, you can see how that would have gone, wouldn't you? I'd have loved to have done that interview. I would never be allowed to. Would I be struck off immediately from the police for being highly sarcastic and inappropriate during such moments? But she just denies it altogether, and she actually tells the police, why would I kill my own kids? My children were never any inconvenience to me, and I accommodated my lifestyle and personal life around them. It is correct that life as a single mother was financially difficult, but I never asked anyone for money. And any suggestions that I used my daughter's ill health or death to make any money is wholly inaccurate and wrong. I'm pretty sure you did text guys specifically letting them know that your daughters may die whilst procuring them for sex to be paid for that sex. Just throwing it in there that the messages are available. But she's trying to get across here that actually the lifestyle that she lived, she got away with it because there were always people who were available, so to speak, who could look after her kids, or she had the guys round inappropriately, but nonetheless it meant that she could still get away with doing what she was doing. And even though I know that this woman is responsible for her children's deaths, I do think that she makes sense in that quote, not the part where she's denying harm, but where she's saying, actually, my lifestyle didn't get in the way. It didn't, did it? It didn't get in the way because she just did it anyway. She wasn't being prevented from going and doing those things. She didn't care enough about her kids to not just get on with doing them anyway. So I think that part is half true. Anyway, although the investigators believe at this point they definitely have the person who's responsible, they still have to establish the motive basically for the killings. Because I suppose when you look at it, aside from the fact that Porton for some reason actually went ahead and wanted them dead, because we can see that through her searches and her actions, it's not necessarily the easiest connection to make as to why she'd gone ahead and done that. Because Louise Porton is not forthcoming. So she doesn't actually give them any information about her motive. And let's go back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of this, where she's found out for stealing from her grandma, and she just does not engage in apologising or even confronting what's gone on. So she's doing this similar MO in this moment, and she just continues to claim her innocence as well. The media understandably blow up about this case. Because this is two little girls who have been murdered. Of course they blow up. Of course they are devastated. You know, the thing about the Western world per se, and it'll be everywhere else, but in my experience of the Western world, is that we care deeply about anybody's kids. We really do. Even on this channel, when I cover child death, the response that I get compassion-wise, the care and consideration that these children are afforded by those watching these cases comes from that desire to just look after the innocent children, to just look after those naive babies that deserve so much more than they are given. And when the press gets hold of a story where a woman has fallen outside of that full and foul of, I suppose, what we stereotypically expect as maternal bonds, but obviously are paternal bonds as well, it does blow up because we can't believe that anyone would do anything so reprehensible to their children. So they start portraying Porton as a woman who has killed her kids for one reason. And the one reason, as far as they're concerned, is they got in the way of a lifestyle. Simple as that. So they felt that they'd specifically got in the way of her having sex. It was her sex work that was paying the bills. It was her sex work that had her main area of interest. It was her sex work that made her financially independent. And those kids were problematic in that lifestyle. So whilst this was a really sensational headline for the press, I genuinely believe that those writing these articles would have believed that this was a plausible reason why she'd killed her kids. I don't think that the evidence supports it. I really don't. I don't think the evidence supports this contention at all, because she had absolutely been indulging in the lifestyle that she'd wanted. She had these two children. It hadn't stopped her at all. She was completely egocentric, completely selfish, self-absorbed. It didn't bother her, the impacts of her lifestyle on her kids. She was quite able to continue doing what she was doing. So it's not enough to imagine that they just got in the way. Now, on the 26th of January 2019, Porton stands in court and pleads not guilty to the two charges of murder. This is at her first appearance at Leamington Spa Magistrates. It's obvious, isn't it, that she's got away with that first death. She's got away with things in the past that are completely unacceptable, and she's just following the same MO. She's just imagining that if she acts like she didn't do it and suggests that she didn't do it, then she's going to be able to manipulate people to some degree. She's not willing to take that responsibility at all. So the trial begins June 2019, and the trial begins at Birmingham Crown Court. At this point, they obviously bring in witnesses, and during the trial, Porton's sister gives evidence on her behalf. And she does tell the jury and the court that Porton did love her children. All the witnesses, they gave a similar account. They said that Lexi and Scarlett were happy, they were well looked after, and they obviously weren't overly concerned about Louise Porton. They didn't think that she had this potential, without a doubt. Sadly though, when they looked at the post-mortems on both of the children, they told a different story, basically. So even though the family is reporting that when they see these girls with the mother, there doesn't seem to be anything intrinsically problematic, they feel that the kids are well looked after, they seem relatively all right, the post-mortem tells a completely different story. They identify that there's been possible earlier assaults. Remember, what you are in front of people is rarely how you are behind closed doors. We all have different shades of ourselves. It's not too hard to behave in front of people that we need to behave in front of. And that's why women and kids and men are killed by partners and by parents, because the reality is that people can act a certain way when they have observers and then transition grotesquely in private. So the prosecution, they claim that Louise Porton killed her daughters because they got in the way of what she was doing, what she wanted, who she wanted to be with, and so on and so forth. And they present all the evidence, including text messages from her sister, because her sister Karen actually accuses Louise Porton of leaving her children to have sex with a man in his van. And in another text message, which is very incriminating, Karen says, "So will you just leave them to go fuck lads?" Louise Porton does still continue to deny that she killed her daughters because they interfered with her sex work. And she states, "My children were never an inconvenience to me, and I accommodated my lifestyle and personal life around them. I still don't know how my daughters died or what caused it. So that's what she put out to the court. The prosecution further allege that she'd purposely killed her children by somehow obstructing their airways, because the deaths had definitely been premeditated, because they had her internet search history. The internet browsing supported this contention. It included searches such as, why did my 3-year-old stop breathing? How long after drowning can someone be resuscitated? Can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? Is it true you shit yourself when you die? Also, she searched for how long it took for a body to go cold up to the shoulder. She'd also read an article that was entitled "Toddler Brought Back to Life After Drowning." Furthermore, of course, the doctors, they couldn't find any natural reason as to why either, let alone both of the children should have died. And in fact, 2 days before Scarlett's death, a social worker had actually seen her and said that the child was chatty, alert and happy, not at death's door, as Louise Porton was trying to express to guys that she was chatting to. So this is clearly at a juxtaposition to what she's tried to present. Now, Porton, as you will imagine, continues to claim that she's innocent. She maintains absolutely that she was not responsible for her children's death. She claims that the internet searches had got nothing to do with their deaths either. Nothing to do. Nothing to do. It's a mere coincidence. But you literally have very specifically related searches, such as, what will happen if you cover the mouth of a child who's got a blocked nose? Yeah, I know. Anyone could search that. You ask about how long it takes to stop somebody being resuscitated. Well, okay, I mean, that sounds a little bit incriminating, but anybody could have done that. And you can just imagine, can't you, what the prosecution are thinking when they've got these kind of facts to put in front of the jury, and how surprising it will be to hear Louise Porton just denying that those searches have got any connection whatsoever. Anything whatsoever. And she actually says to the court, look, I love my kids, that they always made me laugh, that I tried to give them whatever they wanted. But she also did admit that being a parent was not one of the easiest things to do. But she said that in spite of the fact it wasn't always easy, she was able to cope with it. Now, when it comes to actually evaluating this, the jury struggle. They are perplexed. The police are also perplexed as to why Louise Porton has gone ahead and killed her children. So they go ahead and request details of any potential medical conditions that Louise Porton was suffering from, because they're looking at breadcrumbs, so to speak, that can add up to describe what on earth has played out here, what her actions have become, how, why, what is the reasoning behind that. Porton does actually express to the jury that she finds it very difficult to show her emotions. She also says that she struggles to form emotional attachments. Yes, I think we can agree that your family agree with that when you're being violent to them behind closed doors and trying to get away with it, or just not turning up to your nan's funeral, or just, murdering your kids. We can see that emotional attachments are not your strong point, Louise. But when they investigated, they found that there was no evidence that she had any medical condition or that she had a mental disorder that could explain her behaviour. I suppose we could try and throw in Munchausen's by proxy, or factitious disorder by proxy is what is known now. But that doesn't make sense either, because she tries to harm the children, gets some attention, but then actually goes through and kills the kids. Whereas with that kind of disorder, you expect it to be perpetually damaging a child to try to get the attention that you want. And they don't feel that she fits that description or diagnosis. They're not even considering in it. So there is something very unusual about the fact that this woman doesn't seem to have any paradigmal problems where her mental health is concerned, or prior actions that would make you assume that there was a problem. This is perplexing. And because of that, they are struggling with understanding it per se. On the 1st of August 2019, this is after a 4-week trial, jury of 10 men and 2 women. They take just 6 hours to find Louise Porton guilty of murdering her 2 young daughters, which I think we would all agree was the right decision, because there is no other direction that this could go. In considering the sentence, Judge Mrs. Justice Yip, well, she concluded that a mental disorder was not a feature in the case, and surprisingly as well, aside from a caution for wasting police time when she was 15, Louise Porton had got no previous criminal convictions. However, in spite of that, there were still massively aggravating factors in this case. I mean, first and foremost, this is a mother who has killed her children. I mean, that's got to be the biggest breach of trust imaginable. 2 young, vulnerable, trusting, loving children being murdered by their parent. The very person that's going to protect them, love them, keep them safe. And instead, they had callously, willingly, cunningly, calculatingly killed them. The judge stated this: these were blameless young children who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away. The other aggravating factors were that the killings were premeditated. It wasn't as if she just lost her temper and snapped. She planned this. That noted, the judge also identified that Louise Porton had a really immature character, together with the fact that she appeared to struggle to put the needs of others ahead of her own, even when it involved the needs of her own children. Also, it was noted that her young age was a mitigating factor because she was just 21 at the time of the offences. And of course, in the judicial system, there's always hope that people can change. And certainly when you're young, you make decisions that are regrettable that you might not do 10, 15 years down the line. When they were sentencing Porton, all she did was look at her feet, and she had her head resting on her hands, which I know you could be overwhelmed, but it's quite disrespectful, that as well. I appreciate it's also relatively disassociated from the situation, but the idea that she's kind of looking at her feet with her head on her hands, it's kind of showing a level of disinterest, isn't it? This is her being tried for the murder of her kids, and she displayed literally no emotion, no remorse whatsoever. No emotion and no remorse. Think about that. You'd expect to see some of it, wouldn't you? Even if you were trying to act it, do something. Even in front of the jury, if you were lying, at least work on some manipulation techniques to try to seem like a caring parent, but she's not even invested in that. And again, that just says something about her emotional disconnect, a clear emotional disconnect. So when it came to sentencing, this was on the 2nd of August 2019, the judge ultimately sentenced Louise Porton to 2 life sentences. So it was not an easy sentence whatsoever, a minimum term of 32 years. That means she will serve 32 years minimum. The judge stated this: your actions have devastated so many lives. Lexi and Scarlett had so much to offer their wider family, but you took all of that away. And that's true. If she hadn't wanted to look after those beautiful little girls, somebody would have stepped in. Maybe the father who wasn't allowed to have any contact, maybe the sisters who were always present. As aunties, they would have been available. The fact that she wouldn't let that happen is just inexcusable. After the trial, Lexi and Scarlett's father obviously was deeply devastated by this. So Chris Draper said he was broken, and he stated in a victim impact statement this: why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters? You're the mother, the person supposed to care for them, protect them, to love them. They were just an inconvenience to you. How could you do this? I sit and think day and night, and I can't understand why my 2 little girls were taken away because Louise wanted to sleep around. I hate Louise. No punishment will ever be enough, as I will never get my daughters back. It is devastating to imagine he didn't even meet one of those little girls. The investigating officer who was involved in the case said this: I will never be able to understand why Louise Porton murdered her children. She's lied repeatedly to friends, family and professionals to cover her tracks. At no point throughout the whole investigation has she ever shown any real signs of emotion. These were premeditated murders for which she has shown no remorse. And the length of this sentence reflects this. So clearly the investigating officer was satisfied that Louise Porton got what she deserved to some degree. But again, we're seeing that reflection of just no empathy, no compassion, no understanding, no remorse of what she's done at all. Now, in September 2019, this is more than a year and a half after they died, Lexi and Scarlett were finally buried in the West Midlands, after a year and a half after they died. It's awful for families when they have to do that. There has to be a wait because of the trial, etc. Now, their father actually arranged the funeral because he was determined in that last action to let those girls know that they were loved. He wanted to give them a really good send-off. So the girls were taken to their final resting place in a white horse-drawn carriage, which is utterly heartbreaking, isn't it? The fact that those little girls got to go in that princess carriage, but only in their final moments before they were laid to rest. Also, tragically, in February 2020, Porton's own mother, that's 48-year-old Sharon Porton, she's found dead in her home in Willenhall, and it's believed that the reason she took an overdose is because she just was absolutely haunted. She was absolutely devastated and riddled with pain by the fact that her daughter had committed this crime, and of course that she'd lost those gorgeous little girls. And that shows you that ripple effect, doesn't it? When somebody carries out this kind of heinous murder, the impact it has is far-reaching. It's not just the individuals who lose their life, it's the individuals who love the lives that have been lost. It's also worth mentioning, though, that Sharon had had a lot of hate. And this is what drives me a bit mad about online trolling. I appreciate that people feel really angry when people do these things, and that directive anger should be at the individual who's carried out the crime, because that individual has caused this. But when people who have been around that person, albeit you might think the mother didn't do the best job bringing them up, we don't know, but that might be your judgment call. That mother didn't cause what's played out. Louise Porton did that. But instead, Sharon gets horrible abuse, terrible accusations. People blamed her and said that she must have known what was going on. But Sharon said, as did the rest of the family, they had no idea that those little girls were at risk. And a little bit of side information, trolls, by the way, a lot of people think that they're just, harmless keyboard warriors who don't really think about their impact. That's not true most of the time. Tend to have higher egos, feel more superior to other people, and tend to also have the dark triad around their nature, which is Machiavellian traits, narcissism, and a bit of old psychopathy thrown in, which is why they are really not very nice human beings. But again, a lot of people who will be being negative in this circumstance will just be ordinary people who feel desperately sorry for those children. But it shows us that sometimes when we vent our anger in the wrong direction, there can be repercussions that are really, really regrettable. And Sharon's dead. And part of the contribution to that is that she felt that people blamed her, along with all of the shame and guilt that she probably felt herself anyway. This case is just ultimately shocking, isn't it? It's devastating. It involves two little girls, beautiful, perfect little girls with their whole lives ahead of them, being murdered by their own mum. And it feels utterly corrupt and contrary, doesn't it, to human nature. A mother's meant to protect a child, meant to nurture a child, meant to soothe the sadness, do all the things that make kids feel safe. And when we talk about filicide, which this is a very rare case of filicide because it doesn't happen very often, when we actually look at these cases, we tend to expect some kind of mental illness. But Porton was assessed by court-appointed medical experts, didn't have any mental health issues. I mean, that said, in spite of the fact that she didn't have any recognised by the court officials who investigated that, she definitely displayed signs of a really highly narcissistic character, because you can see that most people would put their children's needs first. She put her own needs first. In fact, the one thing we can say about Louise Porton that is consistent through what I've talked about today is that she always came first. She was selfish, she was self-obsessed. This is throughout the short lives of those beautiful children. She expected other people to look after them so that she could go and live a life that she wanted. She wanted to make money as a sex worker. She wanted to sleep with men. She wanted to go clubbing. And being a single mother to 2 children was clearly not conducive to that kind of lifestyle. She also, as I've said throughout, had a very low level, if any level, of empathy. And because of that, she potentially had an incapability of even displaying maternal love for her children. And that, for most of us, is something that we can't even imagine because we feel hardwired. It's just full of it within us, isn't it? Now, instead of being the centre of her world, her children were basically, in the end, a source of resentment, weren't they? To the point where she didn't want them in her world anymore. And I think what's most devastating about cases like this is those little girls meant more to other people around Louise Porton than they did to her own mother. Those 2 little girls meant more to the landlady than they did to her own mother. It's inescapably ruthless and devastating to think that Louise Porton's own children, beautiful little girls, meant nothing to her. Literally nothing. They were just items to be disposed of. Much like the clothes on Facebook. Much like the transactions that came and went with the men. Just things that she could have, things that she could reject, things that she could abandon, things that she could destroy. Louise Porton is a very, very rare kind of human. I think she's probably one of those individuals that most of us would believe was born that way. Because it seems that every single trait that we would anticipate a mother would have, she lacked. And not just lacked, she had the exact opposite. Callousness, cruelty, neglect, complete egocentricity and selfishness. And because of that, 2 perfect little children lost their lives before they even had a chance to begin living them. I hope you feel that we have done those gorgeous little girls some justice in telling this story, and I hope that Louise Porton spends the rest of her life in prison, because I don't think people like her can ever benefit society. I really don't. Thanks for joining me. Let me know your thoughts. Give me a comment. Get involved with the chat. Come back. I release content regularly, and like I always say, let's dedicate this video to those 2 little beauties, Lexi and Scarlett. They deserve so much more, and at least we'll remember their faces. At least we'll remember their value, and at least we will make sure that we hold their images close, because we know what it's like to feel that children have infinite meaning and deserve infinite love. Take care, guys.